Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rich Lyons. I'm the Dean here at Berkeley Haas. I want to welcome you all here today to our Dean Speaker Series. I'm glad you could enjoy this session here today. I also want to welcome our alumni and our executive and evening weekend MBAs who are going to be viewing this real-time via webcast. As you may have noticed, we also have some cameras in the back of the room here. We have C-SPAN with us here today who will be filming the talk with Gabriel. So be thinking about your questions. We will, as usual, have a Q&A session, so we welcome your input. And that input, we need to ask you to use the microphones when the times come. So before I introduce Gabriel, let me just say a few things about our upcoming speakers in this series. As you know, this is our highest level speaker series here at Berkeley Haas. We have a full lineup of industry leaders. Next month, on March 5th, we will host alum Bent Barron, joining us from his headquarters in Switzerland, where he resides as CEO of Cloetta Candies. Next, we'll be hosting an event with our Center for Responsible Business with Lisa Perez-Jackson. Ms. Jackson is currently the VP of International Initiatives at Apple and was formerly head of the EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Finally, on March 19th, we're fortunate to host Ed Catmull. Most of you know Ed, president of Walt Disney and Pixar Studios. Pixar is, of course, right here in the neighboring town of Emeryville. Please take a look at the website for more information on those talks, and we hope you can join us for those talks. So today it's an absolute delight for me to introduce and welcome Gabriel Strickler. Stricker, excuse me. He is a Cal alum. Some of you already know that. He's Chief of Communications at Twitter, Chief Communications Officer. We will be welcoming back not just for this event, but he also has been helping Berkeley think about and celebrate the 50-year anniversary of the free speech movement, which is really quite an important year in Berkeley this year. His Bachelor of Arts was in Latin American Studies as an undergraduate here at Berkeley. His current role as Chief Communications Officer, he leads the global teams for media relations and public policy, and media partnerships more generally at Twitter. He first came to Twitter in 2012, stepping into what some have called one of the world's absolutely highest profile roles in the communications field. He has, in fact, been credited by many with as the driving force behind turning around Twitter's public reputation. Gabriel has been well recognized for his success in the field. He was listed by the Holmes Report as one of the world's 100 most influential corporate communicators, one of PR Week's top 20 digital influencers, and named one of the 20 most effective communications professionals by Business Insider. Prior to joining Twitter in 2012, he was the Director of Global Communications and Public Affairs at Google, where he was active on the issue of free expression and frequently defended the company's refusal to censor information. At Twitter, he accepted the Radio, Television, Digital News Association's First Amendment Award. His earlier work was in campaign politics. He developed his expertise in strategic communications through his work in the electoral arena. Today, we have a chance to talk to him on a variety of topics, of course, free expression and free speech, but also leadership and how he thinks about culture and what makes organizations work better. We'll have a chance also to celebrate with him, as I mentioned, this 50th anniversary of the free speech movement. So it was exactly that 64-65 year. For those of you that know the Free Speech Cafe, I'm sure many of you have been in there, and the pictures of Mario Savio. It is a remarkable tradition for this institution and one that lives on for all of us, of course. It is an important part of this institution. It is an important part of our society, and of course it is the notion of freedom of expression is not equally appreciated throughout the whole world. And part of those different value judgments on where one draws the lines on expression is a very active area worldwide of policy and management. So there's much to cover. Let me introduce to you Gabriel Strickler, and thank you very much for being here, Gabriel. So let me start with the free speech movement. I've mentioned it a couple of times, and when you think, so you weren't here in the 60s, but you, like I, was here a little bit after that. Could you say a little bit about how you think about free speech as it relates to Twitter, and also that, that fine line between freedom of expression and some of the things that happen when sometimes expression is too free?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you all for having me here. It's always lovely to be back. And yep, the free speech movement definitely predated me, but I think that even when I graduated here as an undergrad in the early 90s, that sort of spirit and the disruptive spirit of the free speech movement still lived on. And I think at the time, and I think today still on campus, there's an attempt to figure out how to keep that culture going. The good news is that that culture exists beyond that place, and for many graduates like myself who are now in companies like Twitter and before that at Google, we're still figuring out how to ensure that those values are part of what we do. And for me, I get to go to work every day at a place that is, I think, arguably one of the most extraordinary viral platforms that has ever existed. And it's been this amazing vector of that's facilitated free expression around the world. I know that the mythology is that we create these technologies with free expression in mind, of like, wouldn't it be amazing if we could create this platform that would let all of these flowers bloom? We had ideas, of course, all the time of what the impact of the platform would be, but we never thought that it would be used in the way that it has been and facilitate revolutions as it has, and just giving people voices where they didn't in the profound ways that it does. But yeah, it is an ongoing commitment to upholding the platform as we do. And as you say, it's a tricky one too, because in the same way, for those of you who are less familiar with Twitter, one of the parts of it that has allowed the rise of it as being this platform for free expression is that we support pseudonyms. And so unlike other platforms that require you to give your actual identity, because we allow pseudonym support, if you go into cases like the Arab Spring, for example, turns out that if you want to take down the man, it's a lot easier to do so if you don't have to say, oh, here's exactly who I am and my real identity and my address and so forth. The flip side of that spectrum is if you don't have to give your actual identity, it makes it a lot easier for you to express yourself in, I would say, less constructive ways, not bringing down an oppressive regime, but potentially just in kind of trolling and abusive ways.
Yep.
And it's a tricky balance. It's one that we're today grappling with. Our CEO actually had one of our internal emails leaked out, and our CEO was saying in his words that we have been falling short on striking that balance. And it's something where we're trying to figure out what are the ways to preserve the beauty of the platform as this incredible vehicle for free expression, while at the same time having boundaries in there that prevent people from engaging in what is really at its core abusive behavior.
Yeah.
So it's a daily challenge.
Yeah. And I guess, part of it, if you felt that the pseudonyms allow many things, and then there might be other tools to manage some of these unfortunate behaviors and outcomes that come from it. Huh?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Is there an example where, could you give us an example where, whether it's trolling and things along those lines, where you say, look, we've tried to address that issue in a more targeted way?
Yeah. I can tell you the things that we've done and the kind of things that I think you can expect from us going forward. So some of the things, and some of you may look at this as just sort of fixing bugs. Some of them have been more or less difficult. We historically had done, I think, a pretty lackluster job of making it possible to even report abuse. The amount of hoops people had to go through to even just be able to say, hey, this person is engaging with me in a super abusive manner. It has to be the case that it's roughly as easy to report the abuse as it is to do the abusing. And in our case, it was, I think, for the longest time, really easy to engage in the abuse and really hard to report it. So that has been something that we've gone out of our way to fix. The next step is I think in, again, balancing the ability for someone to express themselves freely, but also giving someone the ability to not have to be exposed to what is abusive behavior. The next step is, because again, for those of you less familiar with Twitter, one of its hallmarks too is that we have an asymmetrical follow graph. And less technically what that means is we can follow each other. We could do that. We can both follow each other, but it can also be the case that you follow me, but I don't follow you.
Yep.
And part of what our thinking is, if you are sending tweets to me throughout the day saying, you're a jerk, if we follow each other, I'm presumably saying, I really want to hear you telling me that I'm a jerk. But if I don't follow you and you're telling me throughout the day that I'm a jerk, and trust me, we have far more colorful examples than just saying that somebody's a jerk. Maybe there should be ways that if you're bombarding me with this, that I should be able to be a little bit more insulated from it. So you should be able to say it, but I should also be able to have greater control of tuning that out. So that's kind of what we're trying to pave the way towards.
It's a super example. By the way, for those of you that are tweeting, we have a hashtag Haas Speakers, Haas Speakers, no gaps, if you want to tweet any of this. And I will certainly tweet. I always take notes, and I always tweet after talks, and I will do it again. I personally so appreciate Twitter. It's interesting. Just a very quick aside, right? When I first became dean, people were saying, "Oh, you should do these blog posts and all this sort of stuff," and I'm thinking, "Holy smokes! I could spend half my day doing that." But 140 characters, once or twice a day, it's just a great bite size for putting out thoughts. And I think for a lot of us that are in seats where we get to hear a lot of interesting things every day, that's one of the functions that I feel like I'm serving, is sort of let me bounce them back out so other people get to hear some of the stuff that I'm hearing. So now recently, Twitter sued the federal government over the ability to disclose more information in its ongoing transparency report. So could you talk a little bit about that public policy interface? Yeah.
So I should just say that Twitter was not the first to have a transparency report. I think actually when I was at Google, we started that process of issuing these transparency reports. And what the transparency reports are simply is when technology companies get requests from governments around the world specifically to take action on certain content. And it could be to remove content because it violates their local laws, to suspend certain accounts similarly because it's against whatever their local policies are. A lot of the companies in our space have felt like there needs to be a way in some centralized fashion to disclose to the people of the world, hey, we're getting these requests, you should be aware of them. But not just to say we're getting these requests, but here are the nature of the requests, and here's what governments are giving us these requests. And by the way, here's how many of them there are and kind of roughly how to categorize them. And then, of course, what action we took coming off of these things. And I guess without getting into too much detail regarding a lawsuit, but just on a high level, it turns out there is a government, it is ours here in the United States, that wanted to limit our ability as a company to tell people, and again, it's not just Twitter users. Yeah. It happens to be that there are individual users who are impacted by this, that we take action on posts that they've made. But if you are, I would argue, if you're a user or if you are just a member of this society, you have a right to know. You have a right to know that your government is making requests of a private company like ours, and what we're doing with that. And we should be able to disclose in a reasonable amount of detail what is the sort of boundaries surrounding those requests, what is going on there. And we had engaged in conversations about this, and in terms of our ability to be more transparent in our transparency report. And finally, when we reached an impasse, we said, we will not abide by this. We will sue you over our ability to be more transparent with with our users and people of the world. And so that's what motivated it, and it continues to motivate it. I think there are other companies that I think share our opinion, but I think we just took another step to force the issue in that way.
And could you, because we had an earlier brief conversation about values, but that's I mean, when one thinks about the culture, the shared values that hold Twitter together, that make it what it is, I would imagine that when you are making a decision about how aggressively to pursue an issue like that, it does come back to very fundamental values. So can you talk a little bit about how that particular decision about transparency connects to the values of the firm?
Yeah, at the end of the day, some of this is not all that complicated. We end up running the company in more or less some kind of golden rule type of way, which is, as we conceive of and implement these policies, would we as users want to exist in a product that has these policies? And by and large, that's what we're trying to do. Or if there is an environment surrounding us that is unfavorable, then we try to go about and change those things. Now, I would say some of these types of decisions, including the decision to sue our own government, are internally pretty uncontroversial because I would say, as a leadership team, we have pretty aligned values. And I think that we've gone about building out a team that it's not in a groupthink way, but we have values, and we believe that there are values that as a leadership team we embody, and that they reflect the value of the users that we have on the platform. It's a responsibility. And earlier we were talking about the free speech movement. I believe that there are a handful of companies in the world, and you probably can count them on two hands, that transcend just being companies and become themselves a movement. And I think Twitter is one. And with that comes real responsibility. People are depending on us to be able to achieve things that go far beyond business or just culture. It's actually achieving higher purpose. And so as we go about our business, these are the types of fairly weighty things that we're considering day in and day out.
It's an interesting notion of when an enterprise becomes a movement, and Twitter is a great example of that. How about the public offering of Twitter? Does the change of ownership and control, did it have an effect?
I think when we were in the process of going public, a lot of people, there were many folks on the sidelines who were saying, all of Twitter's talk of being purpose-driven or what have you, get ready, it's all going to go out the window. And I actually think that when part of the significance in some ways of our lawsuit was eye-opening for many of those people. It was like, oh, wow, these guys are still going to stick to the values that they've been having all along. But of the speculation that existed around how becoming a publicly traded company would change us, I think somehow, some way, this was the conspiracy theory premise of it all, I guess is how I would frame it, is, now that they become a publicly traded company, are beholden to investor interests, they will sell out their values in order to adhere to all these financial pressures which have existed all along. P.S., those pressures did not exist all along. It never was the case in all of our time that the sort of tension that we experience day in and day out was a tension somehow between everyday users and business interests. That was never the source of the tension. The source of the tension is sort of what we were talking about earlier, which is the tension that exists between one group of users and another group of users. And how do we navigate those waters? Those tensions still exist. But being a publicly traded company, I don't think has done nothing to change our values or how we've approached going about our work. I think it's brought maybe a slightly brighter spotlight, but it's for those of you who will go out and be parts of publicly traded companies pre and post IPO, I hope that you'll come to realize that it is just yet another moment in the company's evolution, and then you go public, and then you wake up the next day and go to work. That's how that is.
What do you obviously love your job? What do you love most about your job?
I do think it goes back to the idea of it being a movement, because I think you can work at any number of companies or organizations, but there are few opportunities that you have in life. We were earlier, before we were hopping on stage, we were talking about these sort of 4 precepts that you have here at the business school, and I love this 4th one of beyond yourself. What an inspiring plank to have on your platform. And what I love about my work, and what I really just have long been inspired by in technology generally, is if you're lucky, you get to be part of a company that is a movement that is beyond itself. It's beyond any one of us. And the impact that you get to have on the planet starts to go beyond, I went to work and I sold a widget, versus I went to work today and I changed the world for the better. It sounds trite, but I think that certainly for us, we got to see this, and the technology, in Twitter's case, begins to take on a life of its own and be used in ways that we would have never anticipated. And it's inspiring. It's just absolutely inspiring.
It really is. It's Biz Stone spoke for us not so long ago, a few months ago, and I was walking back. He spoke across the street, which is why I'm pointing over there. But he and I were walking back, and one of our employees here, who had grown up in Iran, walked up to us as we were coming on to the premises here, and she talked about how influential Twitter had been for her family, and she had some remarkable stories, and it was just right there, right? Somebody that I see every day talking about her family and the role that Twitter played. I mean, I know you hear those stories often, but it was very poignant.
We hear them often, and we see this unfolding, but and I was actually just talking to some of employees, a group of employees who just started yesterday, and they were asking basically about, does this ever get old? Do we ever come to work and kind of get jaded by, oh yeah, this extraordinary thing happened? No, we don't get jaded by that. It doesn't get old. I mean, I came to work a couple weeks ago, and as a user, got to see somebody who's tweeting images of our planet from geostationary orbit. Like, that doesn't get old. And hopefully, if it does get old, we should go do something else, because I think, no, we never thought that these things would be used in this way, but it does change the world in now sometimes more trivial ways too, but sometimes extremely profound ways.
Absolutely. And so your job is different than a lot of people's roles. Could you talk a little bit about maybe some on the personal advice front, some risks that you took that sort of opened up some pathways that might not have been there in your career?
Yeah. So, and please, since another one of your planks is here's to question the status quo. So do not take my status quo as the gospel. But so now my responsibility at Twitter is overseeing our communications team and our public policy team and our media partnerships team. And it's a departure from really what I was doing earlier in my career, which was working on political campaigns. And look, electoral politics is a perfectly noble profession. But I think that the main insight that I had was that my hunger for participating in that process was facilitating some form of social change. And what I realized at a certain point was that the impact that I myself could have on that social change was pretty limited. And I was living on the East Coast at that time, and I was looking back to the West Coast where I grew up, and I was like, that's where the change is happening. Those are the people who are really revolutionizing the world. I want to be part of that. And I say coincidentally, actually, it's not that unlike what happened during the free speech movement, where you had people who were literally watching newsreels at the time on the East Coast of the United States of what was happening here in Berkeley and saying, I want to be part of that thing. And I guess the lesson that I would give on this is that when I look back on it, I had known for some time that electoral politics, I wasn't getting what I wanted to or needed to out of it. And I think it probably took me longer in hindsight than it should have to make the change. And I think I talk to people, particularly new grads who work with us, a lot about this, where you may not be certain what your sort of calling is and what your passion is. And in that case, keep experimenting. But the flip side of that is there are many people, and if you really push them on it, they will tell you, they'll say, I don't know what my calling is, but what I'm doing isn't that. And yet they don't have the courage to make the change.
Yeah.
And so for me, the main lesson was when I knew that that wasn't my calling, it probably was, I don't know, a couple of years before I really owned that and said, you know what, I'm gonna honor the fact that I know this isn't the right path for me and go and pursue something else.
Yeah. And part of that transition, I think, for all of us is that at the kernel of that notion of facilitating social change, right? We don't always know what that kernel is, right? Once we kind of identify a kernel, then sort of the options that are likely to be more aligned become a little clearer. And
that's what I'll tell you. For me, part of the insight that I had came out of trying to create a little bit of distance from it and saying, okay, what is it that I'm doing? What's the pleasure that I derive from this? What is it that's inspiring to me about it? But is this the best sort of venue for me to be living that out?
Yeah.
And even in the world of media and communications and public policy, I didn't necessarily know that there was like, that is the job for me. But I did, that the insight that I had was, it seems like technology is the general venue for this for me to live this out.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. And on you as Gabriel, as a leader, as a manager, what is your leadership style? Have you thought your thinking on leadership changed in the last few years?
So my thinking on leadership and management is in many ways informed by my experience in political campaigns, which if you were going to have, first on management and then I would just say on leadership, but if you were going to try to create a Petri dish of how not to manage people, you would have created a political campaign. It is at the and I suppose, to be fair, it's been a long time since I've worked on a political campaign, so let me just give that space the benefit of the doubt and say maybe a lot has changed in the meantime. But at the time, it was, in this country at least, so you have an environment where it is very transaction-based. You have a bunch of people who are trying to win something by a certain date, and it doesn't lend itself to really nurturing people over a long period of time and invest in their careers and growth over a long period of time. It's really transactional in that way. So for me, so much of, I would say, my approach to management and then more broadly leadership was informed by what not to do.
Happening.
And I think the beauty of the technology industry is you end up getting a lot less experienced people who bring really, really new ideas to the table. And if you can embrace that, and so I would say, to the question of my leadership style, I really, really try to give people a ton of room to make a lot of small mistakes. And I believe that as leaders and managers, and again, sometime from now you could have someone else on this stage who says, "Yeah, I want people to fail," and it's easy to say. And I think you can't just say that. You actually really need to, especially for less experienced people, you need to go out of your way to force them to make mistakes. And I remember I had someone who would work for me who was so risk averse. And I would say, you really need to make mistakes. You really got to, you need to be taking more risks. And we have these kind of quarterly objectives and measurable goals. A lot of companies have these things. And I had said to her, look, here's what's going to happen for you when you set out your quarterly goals. I want you to put in there that you're going to make a certain number of mistakes. And at the end of the quarter, we're going to report back on the mistakes that you made and what you learned from them. And I think unless you're really deliberate with people about this, it's not going to happen. I guess my style is encouraging people to take risks, encouraging them to make mistakes, and having an understanding that they are unable to make catastrophic mistakes. Because if somebody who's working for you makes a catastrophic mistake, that is your responsibility as a leader, that you put them in a situation that they could even make a catastrophic mistake to begin with. You should put them in a position where they can make small learning mistakes. And then really, if there is something that is cataclysmic that's happening on your watch, it's up to you to take responsibility for it. That's how you gain trust as a leader.
It's terrific. And those are the stretch assignments as well, often, Indeed. Right, where they're doing that. I just popped into my head, but one of our faculty, Nobel Prize winner, Ollie Williamson, I remember he was giving a speech. It was a commencement speech. And he was mentioning that he had a PhD, it was a PhD student in this case, but there was a project, and he was describing what he wanted the PhD student to do. And the PhD student said, I don't know if I can do that. And he said, I wouldn't have asked you to do it if I didn't think you could do that, right? So there's a profoundly validating element of pushing people to places, obviously, that, so that's a great management style in itself. Can I ask you one more question about culture, and then we'll open it up to the floor, because I know we have a lot of questions and thoughts in the room. So when you think about your sort of role as a on the senior team in helping to shape and strengthen and keep healthy the culture, the norms and values within Twitter, can you say a little bit about how you think about that part of your role, that kind of inward-facing role?
Yeah, this is so culture is a living, breathing thing, and I think as especially in the technology world, where you have companies like Twitter that are young. Twitter will turn 9 later this year. I know that for some of you hear this, you imagine like, my God, this has been there forever. Twitter has not been there forever, not even close. And yet, because of, I think, the sort of truncated cycles of our world in the media and technology worlds, there's a sense of attachment to things, including culture. And so even in companies like ours, there is this sort of pull to preserve parts of our culture. And at Twitter... And
are they well identified?
They are. I mean, we have certain, like you have these 4 core values. At Twitter, we have a number of them too. And we want to create a culture where those values can continue to exist. But that's different from preserving a culture. And I actually think, so inwardly facing, our responsibility as a leadership team is to create an environment where those types of values can continue to flourish. And also being really open-minded about when some of these things are falling down. And I'll give you a specific example. We have 2 core values which are deliberately in opposition to one another. One of which is to be rigorous and get it right, and another is to ship it. We talk about launching things as shipping things. Now, ship it is like just get it out the door. Be rigorous and get it right is a very different, sort of slower, thoughtful kind of value. And those 2 things are at odds with one another. And when, as a company, we felt like, hey, the fact that these 2 things are at odds with one another is slowing us down. It's creating tension that we don't need. It's building in headwinds that are unconstructive or counterproductive, I guess. Then it's our responsibility as a leadership team, one, to acknowledge this. Because I think where companies tend to fall down is these things, sort of passive voice, exist. Oh, this is happening. No, it isn't happening. You're building this. You sit at that table. If you're doing nothing, you're just standing by, then you're facilitating this apparently counterproductive thing to happen. So let's, one, acknowledge that this is going on, and two, acknowledge for everyone outside of that room that it's going on, and say, hey, look, even if it's the case we don't have the answer, this is something that we're thinking about and are trying to address. And I think part of us as a culture, we were talking earlier about our external transparency report. We try to be pretty radically transparent internally too. And so as a leadership team, sure, we're deliberating over any number of things that impact our culture, but we try whenever possible, even if it's in progress, to share that with the company as it's happening.
That's great. That's a great internal norm, I think. It's, those are some of the difficult conversations that aren't usually framed quite that way. Normally when we hear the phrase difficult conversations, we're thinking about a manager and a direct report and something didn't go right. But this notion of saying, hey, this is a tension in our work environment. We don't have the answer yet, but let's talk about it and think about it. That's a great example. Questions from the audience, please. Let's open it up. We've got a couple of microphones. I'll ask you to use the microphones. We want to make sure to capture it in the video. And we also, I think, have the capacity for questions to come in from remote. Please, ma'am.
Yeah, a recent article on NPR highlighted the role that Twitter was playing in citizen journalism in Mexico with the cartel violence that was erupting. And one woman's account was then hacked, and it stated that she had died. And I was curious, in these violent situations, what response, if any, does Twitter have?
And so I'm not familiar with this one. So the account or the material that was going out from her account was not true, or ended up being true?
She was reporting on the violence. And
I see. And
no one was entirely clear if she ever was a real person.
I see.
Or not, or if she
so,
was murdered.
So I would say that in the context of violence or any kind of crisis kind of situation, part of we get this question a lot, actually, because I'll give you a slightly more tame example than violence in Mexico, but still it relates. In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, there were accounts on Twitter of flooding in this place, and people even had these falsified photos of certain places that were underwater. And there, like in the case of Mexico, you had these questions like, hey, Twitter and other social media seem to be giving rise to potential misinformation. And as I was saying earlier, it is, I really do believe, one of the most extraordinary viral platforms that has ever existed. And as such, it can be a vector for the viral spread of misinformation. But what I always point out in this context is the spread of misinformation in the context of some kind of a crisis, breaking news situation is not new. It far predates certainly social media. And the example I would give from sometime after I graduated from here was the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. And before social media, you had established media, and the news accounts at the time were that there were people of a certain ethnicity who purportedly executed that bombing. The difference, though, and I think this is the key distinction in what the sort of double-edged sword of social media is you're right, it absolutely can be this vector of misinformation. But the difference that I would argue at that time is I don't remember exactly the confines of it, but if you go back, I promise you it wasn't minutes that misinformation was out there. I mean, perhaps somebody here knows exactly how long the duration was. It seems to me it may have been days in many circles. And the fundamental change is that you have, on one hand, with platforms like Twitter, an opportunity for incredible on-the-ground reporting. I'm standing on the Hudson River. There's a plane. It just landed there. Here's a picture. And we later find out this is true. Or I'm standing on the corner of this corner of Bleecker Street and we're underwater. P.S. It's not true. The beauty of social media, though, is that it has accelerated the time, I think, of debunking these things. And so I would argue that if we were able to rewind the tape to the Oklahoma City bombing, that tragedy, were we to have had a platform like Twitter, I think you might have accelerated the time it took to debunk the misinformation that was out there. So yeah, that misinformation exists, but it can also get put back in its place, I think, even better and more quickly now.
Thanks for that. Please. Can you use the microphone? Sorry. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So I'm wondering what's your view on Google withdrawing from China, more specifically to provide limited but still more superior service to 1.4 billion people compared to just no service at all?
Yeah. That was definitely the most challenging chapter of my time at Google, without a doubt. And it was a source of real soul searching at the company. And what I can tell you is first, let me tell you where we stand on this at Twitter, and then I can try to shed some light on kind of how that went for us at Google. So Twitter is currently blocked in China. As much as we would love for people in China to be able to freely access Twitter, they cannot. And what we've said is that we're unwilling to make the kinds of sacrifices that we believe we would need to make in order to be unblocked there. Perhaps there is a world in which Twitter could be unblocked, but it would require sacrifices that we're just not prepared to commit to because of our values. And in the case of Google, I would say it was very similar. It just, the difference was for us at the time to continue operating there, it was requiring levels of sacrifice that we were unwilling to continue to sign up for. You can absolutely argue, as it was argued extensively internally at the time, that, well, being there, even in this diminished capacity and giving people some access to the service is better than nothing. But what I'll tell you about the experience at the time was, the premise of it was, well, we'll be there and hopefully the trend line will be one of sort of greater and greater openness. And yet we viewed the opposite, that coinciding with our presence there was a move towards more and more closed behavior and limited access. And then finally, at the time when we decided to take the action that we did, actual targeting of activists and dissidents. And I think for many of us there at the time, the question was, what for? Why are we doing this? What is the benefit that's coming from our presence? And it didn't really seem like it was benefiting the people in mainland China, and it didn't seem like it was benefiting people outside of mainland China either. So it's a perfectly valid question, and it was one that required literally years of deliberation on our part, but that was the conclusion that we came to, and it's I would say a similar conclusion that we've come to at Twitter.
Thanks for that. There's a over here, please. Thanks.
Feel free to line up if you want to.
So one of the things I think with Twitter that's interesting is you've been seeing a decline, or not at least the growth that people want to see for monthly active users. And I've heard, one of the trends is around syndication, how's Twitter being integrated in TV shows, et cetera, as a greater measure of the impact that Twitter's having. But now that you're talking today about kind of the free speech movement and Twitter as a movement, I've been wondering, do you have any thinking around what metrics you could use to more quantitatively measure how Twitter's being used as a movement? and whether it's where you wanted to see it and the kind of impact it's having as a company.
Yeah, this is a great question. So, and actually before, when I was saying that I feel like being a publicly traded company really hasn't changed us, but has, I think the sort of spotlight is maybe brighter. This is a great example. We love the growth that we're seeing with the company. There are people who, in the sort of investment and analyst communities, who I think have their own ideas of what that growth should look like. I think the disconnect is if you just view Twitter through the lens of monthly active users, it is missing a whole part of the equation, and it certainly misses it in the context of this broader movement. And so for us, when we think about the impact that we have and how best to measure it, it has much more to do with the total audience associated with any given moment than it does the specific number of monthly active users who are exposed to something. It has much more to do with the number of people who got to view and interact with a tweet associated with the Oscars or the Super Bowl or elections in the UK than the individual number of people who produced a tweet. It has much more to do with this audience, total audience, than it does this limited slice of a user base. So that's more of how we think about it. And more, I guess, most recently, you saw us start to experiment with different kinds of logged out experience that would allow you, if you are not a monthly active logged in users, to experience this. And so that's how we're thinking about it. And hopefully, yeah, it will absolutely let people experience that part of the global conversation.
And when you use the term audience, I mean, you're not just thinking sort of collective followership, right?
That's right.
It's retweets, it's expressions of engagement with the content, right?
Yeah, if you look at it like this, if you're Barack Obama and you want to tell the world that you've just been reelected as President of the United States, you take to Twitter to do so, and you tweet out 4 more years as he did, but you take to Twitter to do so not because it's only your X million followers and X million monthly active users who see that. You do that because that tweet gets syndicated around the web, around the world, broadcast on television. That's your audience that's exposed to that particular expression. And so our users already think of it in this way, and it's just a question of, I think your question's totally valid, which is, okay, but what are the ways to sort of quantify that? And we're certainly thinking along those lines.
Yeah, great question. Are there things that keep you up? And we have time for some more questions, a few more. Are there things that are, and we've talked about a few things that might keep one up at night. Can you give us some examples of things that, as you look out on the horizon, that feel like they might be worrisome?
I think, the China example is a fair one. We have been blocked at various times by other countries around the world too. These are things that keep us up because when suddenly people are unable to access this platform that gives their voice this broader sort of megaphone, it's really, really challenging for us of how to navigate those waters, and how do we do that while continuing to uphold our values. So, I think that those are things, certainly for me, those are things that are really, really challenging on a daily basis.
You, right? Especially for you, because you get the first call, right?
Gabriel, I often do.
What do you think?
I often do.
Yeah. That's remarkable. How often do you tweet?
Several times a day, I'll tweet or retweet. One of you, I think, was tweeting that you were excited to have me here. Thank you. Was that you? I responded to that.
There we go.
It's a pleasure to meet you in the real world. I should say again, in terms of just to tread lightly and question the status quo, in part because for me I feel like what is a pretty publicly visible position.
Yeah.
And I am myself a pretty private person. I end up using Twitter more for professional purposes. And so you'll see me tweeting out things like, hey, if we just issued our transparency report, that's the kind of thing I want people to know about.
Exactly.
I know that there are a lot of other people who are tweeting about seeing their daughter's first steps. My daughter's first steps were experienced by me in the comfort of my home and weren't disseminated in this way. But that's up to each his or her own feeling. But yeah, that's my particular usage.
Yeah. When people do talk about sort of occasionally, because I tend to use it professionally as well, but occasionally I'll tweet about my kids, and I think people, if it feels it sounds authentic to them, I think they respond pretty favorably to that.
It's lovely. It's lovely. As a user, I just some of those moments where I get to see this unvarnished look at people who I never would have access to. I love those kinds of experiences. To be able to be exposed to interactions between people, I love those experiences too. And to the extent that there's an appetite from some of you out there to see that unvarnished look at me, I'm happy to catch up over a coffee sometime, but that's not something I put on display.
Are there any tweets you regret?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think, honestly, no, and maybe this is because I'm a fairly cautious person. No, I don't. There's certainly none that I regret. There are plenty that I regret other people having done for them. But no, I stand by them.
That's great. Well, sometimes this was a relatively recent tweet of mine, and I thought it was relatively harmless. My daughter, who's 11, Nicole, had a civilization's history textbook, right? It was going through, and I just picked it up, started leafing through it, and it mentioned that as best experts can tell, that Christ was not born in the year 0. The Christ was born in the year 5 BC, or that's the best guess. And so I tweeted that I had just learned this, and am I the last to know? And so the birth date of Christ is a pretty important date for a lot of people in the world. And I got a little response to that tweet. And I was trying to be the scientist, but no, it was one of those things, right? No, it got a little bit more response than I expected, but
so if it makes you feel any better, we had Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson out here in the Bay Area last week, and he came by the office, and I was asking him about this extraordinary exchange that he had. Some of you may have seen this, but I think it was last Christmas. He tweeted out in his inimitable way that on this day, I guess on December 25th, he tweeted out, on this day, we celebrate someone. I'm going to do a bad job of paraphrasing, but just understand this is the spirit of it for all of you fact checkers out there. On this day, we celebrate a man who was born, who by the time he was 30 revolutionized the world. Happy birthday, Isaac Newton. Well, it turns out that people assign very, very special value to December 25th. And he heard an earful about it. But to your question, any tweets that we or others regret, he certainly was unapologetic in having made that. And, I think, again, people are provocative in their lives. He is certainly a provocative member of our society, and I think he's probably just as provocative now as he was before Twitter. It's just that we all get to experience it along with him. So, and those types of behaviors, I love seeing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of why the university is such an exciting place, right? The marketplace for ideas is open, right? And that's why we love it here so much. Gabriel, thank you very, very much for being here today. Thank you
for having me. Thank you.